morning, everybody. My name is Pat Bowie, and I work with the Magnolia Community Initiative, but I do that actually in partnership with a number of folks. It's a large endeavor. Magnolia actually is a learning laboratory around how we might get to population level change. One of my key partners in this, so she definitely gets credit for what I'm going to talk to you about, is Maureen Ankelis at the UCLA Center for Healthier Children, Families, and Communities. And when I say that Magnolia is a learning laboratory in terms of what are the interventions, the practices, how do we actually really drive to community level change, a full population change, it's also our learning laboratory to think about, and what is the measurement strategies and the measures that we need in order to kind of do that work. So we're also using that as a place of practice. So we do this work and we support this work with other communities by all means, and that's growing more all the time. But Magnolia really is a special place for us where we really get to go down deeper and really reflect about what we're doing in the learning and swap things out as they're not working. So how did we come about this? And where are we in terms of how does measurement actually lead to learning and action? And for us, the goal was to choose measures that help a network of independent organizations that, again, we're looking to actually transform outcomes for a population, right? And shape the conditions for families that can actually lead to positive outcomes within a community. So we were looking and asking, we want to know that we can reflect on how our practice affects goals for children in that context, how we can reflect on and act as a system, and how do we take actions that better produce results for families and synergy of efforts across the community. So what is our challenge? And I don't think this is going to be a shocker to anyone, because this isn't the learning that we got from Magnolia. This is the learning that we got by talking to all kinds of folks in all kinds of places, right? All that we actually could do and needs to be done exceeds our current capacity if we're really going to drive to these goals, right? We have siloed systems, programs, the linkage to families, to the services and supports is really fragmented. The access and quality of the services that we're actually providing is pretty low or pretty invariable, and very little incentive to do better, to really drive that improvement change. And we have many disconnected programs and providers that limits any kind of synergy of efforts, right? And what I would say, now we have many initiatives, right? It isn't just programs in areas, it's initiatives. It was not lost on me that a couple of the examples that were coming in were all LA. Right? California Endowment in LA, LAPD, right? And all of those things are all happening in the midst of everybody else trying to get that synergy. It's where and how do we get that synergy? And what we would also say, and what we've heard, is folks needing that opportunity to say, but it isn't just getting the data, it isn't just having shared measurement, right? It's what about a change process? What do we actually do with it, right? So we actually reflected upon and thought about, well, what is it that we know? How can change efforts actually get stuck? So we have a couple of things that we say that we know, that we work on too many complex problems and ideas all at one time, right? Or then we do the reverse, that we pursue too many small activities that are never going to get that collective impact, right? That synergy, that larger impact. Right? We focus all our resources on a single outcome when we know it's interrelated and complex. Right? We apply strategies from one sector without actually thinking about how we actually translate that to another sector. How do we align what we're doing? We focus on policy without any emphasis on what is that practice change that is actually going to support the implementation of that. And what we talk a lot about with groups is neglecting that human and technical aspect of change, right? So what we laid out and found for ourselves is, well, how do we kind of frame some guiding questions that can help us get underneath that? What would a shared measurement system look like? So starting just that question, well, what are the key outcomes for children, right? But underneath that, what are the intermediate outcomes? So what's the direct influences on child outcomes that we can change? And we mean child outcomes, child life course, right? Just what do we know about this? And then we move to the question about what are the care processes or family experiences that will have the greatest impact? And what are those care processes that we can actually move on a more regular basis, on a quarterly basis? What's going to be the action? And then this is a key question, and what were those measures that you can use that actually are going to motivate people to change, right? And that they actually can move on. And and if we're going to set goal targets, and goal targets are actually critical, that we base them in the results that any system has achieved, right? We don't just say we're going to do 100%. If no one ever has actually achieved 100% and they haven't probably gotten over 20%, it's a little unlikely that you're going to see 100% in a year's time, 2 years' time, even 10 years' time. So what are we actually dealing with in that complexity of that? And then the next thing that we actually discussed and figured out is, but even within our measurement and what we do around measurement, it's got to be feasible, right? There can be a situation of too many measures, right? Right? And then measures that are vaguely defined, right? Or that can be interpreted differently by different players and different actors, right? Measures are too complicated for anybody to understand. Right? We spend all our time trying to explain what that measure is. And our collection and our reporting process takes too much time. So that we're not getting that feedback, right? You start your program, ends in a year, you don't get your evaluation back until a year after you finish the program. Who's even paying attention anymore, right? That kind of a scenario. And then what we've spent, collecting that, and collecting in a reporting process takes too much time, but displaying of the measures doesn't help tell the story. Thinking about, and that was a point that Haley hit on, right? Like, how do we give that data back that can really tell the story? And then measuring is not at the right level, right? And that means different players need different information depending on who they are and what they are trying to act on. So we think of it, we've been thinking a lot about this measurement at level, right? Because the big thing about, every community, every place, let's get that scorecard, and that scorecard's going to drive change. Well, that scorecard is critical. That's big. That's the big dots, right? What's that balanced scorecard? What's that profile? So what are the key targets that you got to keep an eye for? And that's great for policymakers, making those big key decisions. But other folks have to think about drivers. Right? So what are we actually going to do to try to drive those changes? So what's our theory behind that? So what is the set of events that actually has to take place that we would actually need to get synergy going? And then for the projects or the narrowing it down, are we actually doing what we said we would do, and are we doing it in a way that's actually getting a result? So different players all along need different pieces of data in front of them in order to inspire them to act. So how have we thought about this? And we've come at this concept of a family of measures. So a shared measurement isn't one measurement strategy. It isn't one measure. It's a family of measures. And we thought about domains in source. And why I put this up here, not because this is it. It's because it really says, there are different measures for each of these different questions that we have to ask and that we have to know what's going on. And when we say feasible and actually able to collect it, heaven forbid you leave here thinking that doesn't require work. It does require work. But what data is available, where and at what level? So wherever possible, how do you think about how are we using the publicly available data sets? When is that actually not helping us or drilling us down to know deep enough about what action are people taking and what do they need to take those actions? And is that action making a difference? And what about neighborhoods and understanding neighborhood life? So even if we get the big data sets, does it really help us create a picture of understanding what about all those neighborhood effects? What's going on in the confluence of things within a neighborhood? So we broke this out by domain, then looked at data sources and data collection strategies that we could use. And then what was our periodicity? Like how often would we collect that? When does it make sense? When would we expect to see change, right? And trying to put a whole measurement system together. This is what Magnolia has as its public dashboard. So this is one way we display the data. This is not the best PR piece by any stretch of the imagination. I want to own that completely up front. But it really, what it is a visual representation that goes in front of. Magnolia has a network of partners, 70 partners. It comes in front of folks at a quarterly basis that looks at an aggregate of the data from the bottom up to the top. The bottom is, are we doing what we said we would do? Is it making the difference that we thought it would make, all the way up to, and are we actually having any impact on the conditions of families that are going to drive changes for kids? So this is what we've come through, and what we talk about with other communities is how might you think about designing a dashboard, and what is the difference of a dashboard, and what does it do for you, right? So if you see those child well-being, child outcomes, those milestones, like that becomes a trajectory. That's the life course, right? And what we know is child well-being, say if that's at kindergarten, that's quite predictive of third grade reading, which leads itself into graduation rates, which leads out into college. So what we're saying is we're not saying this is the one, we're just saying that's the level on the top. What are those anchors that's your long-term achievement? And then what are the conditions that context is happening in? Right? So what is it that you would actually need or want to see move that you think would really drive that change in outcome? And then what are the routines and behaviors that are embedded that could really actually change those conditions? And what literally are the actions of the network? What can people do about that? We have a mantra that, and I try to share it with other folks too, is don't plan for others, right? Plan, and making a decision is because you have the influence and the ability to act, and it's something that you actually feel acting on is going to make a difference. And then we do add on the bottom this is the reach. And this is on the dashboard, and you couldn't see it, but it's this tiny piece to remind ourselves that if we're actually going to go for a population outcome, the folks who we touch are not the complete population, right? So what is our reach, right? So we know, for example, that 98% of the kids in an area, the Magnolia catchment area, have a well child visit, right? See a doctor at least once in a year. So, but when we look at the data that we can get and understand from the folks that are participating in that network, they're only reaching about 20% of those kids. So even the best that we do in improving all of the practices and all the healthcare and all of that is not reaching the full population. So it's a reminder, right, about where are folks and what's influencing and how are folks actually getting their care. So it's that constant understanding of we got to go deep within our sector, but we also need to go cross-sector if we're going to actually achieve a population outcome. So these are some of the examples that we use. All right. So then how can data inspire systems, thinking, learning, and taking action? So what are we actually doing with the data? So this is kind of how we think about the use of data. So we use data in a network to drive action. So it's a series, and we've taken these practices from business, right? Healthcare improvement has introduced these practices, right? It's network improvement, customer satisfaction type stuff, which is what is some quick surveys that people can do on a monthly basis that it's about the agreements they have on how parents should experience that system from the voice of the parent. That gets converted into a run chart, so every agency can get back the data on how well did you do on these. And that's what gets aggregated onto the dashboard where everybody can then see where they fit with everybody else. What does that look like? Because what we're basically trying to say is we don't think we're getting synergy. You know, LAPD might be doing this phenomenal thing of reducing crime, but is the school folks, are they like coming up? Are we actually, is that being communicated out in a way that the parents in that neighborhood actually know that that neighborhood is safer? Do they feel it? What's their perception? What's their reality? We need to get synergy out of that. And then we bring folks for that face-to-face, for that collective action. So the bars on top, so these measures, this is understanding child's well-being. This is a measure that we use. It's an early developmental index that we use. And it's been introduced, it started and developed in Vancouver, Canada, adopted by Australia. It's being introduced in over 50 cities and communities in LA. But it paints a really good picture of where kids are, and what we have agreed on nationally is kind of the domains of school readiness, if you will. And we can talk more about that, but what we do is we purposely try to put in front of folks, like, what's our understanding of this? What's the full population that we're looking at? How well overall are all kids doing, right? And then finding that, remember if we said if we want to move kids, what are we actually doing and how are we supporting families? So how do we understand actually the local conditions for families? And this is data that we use a quarterly survey that goes out through the WIC sites. So we have an agreement. The WIC sites, they do a lot of data. They do a lot of data collection. They're a nice universal point within the community of really the reach into the population. And then on a quarterly basis, we ask these questions about family conditions. So we're putting in front of us what's actually happening. And as I mentioned, what we actually give is the actions that folks have agreed on that they think are the first step in driving those changes in family conditions. And folks get this back monthly to be able to say, are we actually doing what we said we would do so that we could begin to change, right, the results for families. And then we bring this all together to try to make this shared measurement really about shared learning and action. So we have a goal target, right? So one of the issues is discussing resources for social support. Social isolation is a concern, a major concern. Everyone agreed. If collectively, everyone within the network, community residents, community groups, actually tried to address social isolation, tried to make that reach and connection with folks, that you could actually head off longer term problems, right? You could intervene early, and social isolation is a risk factor. So this is how folks did across. So this is what we say the opportunities for learning. Partner A is hitting that mark 100% of the time. And then you've got partner B who's not hitting that mark at all. And everybody's agreed to try to do something. So it's bringing folks together so partner A can go, partner B can go, well, what are you all doing? You know, I just can possibly do this. And folks say, well, no, it's actually not that hard. This is actually what we do. And we begin and we use improvement science to help and coach people to really making that difference. And then collectively, because that can be one sector, and then collectively bringing that to see how are the different sectors doing on that same measure. Is there something going on in one sector that actually could be supportive and translated into another to really actually improve outcomes for all? And then we bring data in as a way to try to introduce systems thinking, right? So here's what proportion of parents with a concern about their child leave a healthcare visit with an idea about what they can do to address that concern, right? So this is what we kind of, just to lay out kind of an example, and this is the way we kind of work with folks to say what we're talking about when we say what is systems thinking, what is systems measures, right? So doctors ask the parent if they have any concerns about 60% of the time. Parents share their concern about 75% of the time. Doctors evaluate the concern based on the history in the home environment about 60% of the time. and the doctor and parent plan how to address the concern about 60% of the time. And that gives us a result of the system. Anyone really quick with math? Right? 16% of the time, right? So it's an idea to reflect on. It isn't one intervention, one time. There's a series, there's a sequencing, right? And this is part of why we feel like we're not getting the synergy and the results. But we keep weaving that in as part of the learning within the system. And then another example is if you think about the current parenting conditions. So in these community surveys, these WIC surveys, of the parents with children 0 to 5 reporting social isolation, 41% of those folks are saying they feel socially isolated. And then the average number of network organizations that these parents are linked to is 1, right? So then we begin to ask, well, then what needs to change, right? If they're coming into contact, many of them with at least one provider, but they're socially isolated, could we actually successfully link families across the network by using a common set of prompting questions or warm handoffs? So these are just examples of how we try to bring in the systems thinking, system measures. And this is another piece of that, is what percentage of the local residents are in contact with one partner? Right? So we do this even as a game, like what do folks think this is, right? Social isolation is a big issue. People spend a lot of time and energy doing outreach, trying to find those families, trying to connect. And what we found out was 89% of the folks had actually been in contact. So it's not a question of outreach, it's a question of inreach, right? It's a question of what could the system do to perform, to do better on that. And so of the parents who lack social connections, what percent are linked to a network partner? So who's already coming into contact with one of the network partners? 85% of those folks, right? So that's what we mean by trying to shift from individual program, individual interventions, to actually putting data back in ways that reflect how is the system working? How are we working as a system? And we shift data, and as I was saying, that where you are and who you are in the system, really, like the data has to be meaningful for you to want to act on that drives your passion, that drives your interest. So when thinking about parents and residents, it's giving data and feedback and growing with them around what is the data that is actually going to propel them in ways that actually are meaningful to what they care about and the contribution and the difference they want to make in their kids' lives, their own lives, their neighborhoods, right? And so this parent survey, that community survey, parents also actually engage with. And what we hear, and I'm sure this is going to be of no big surprise, and we hear this in many communities all over the place. People come ask me questions all the time. I'm exhausted by having to fill out surveys and give feedback. No one ever comes back and tells me what any of this was for or what came of it, right? So what we've done is initiated a whole different strategy that has meaning for parents and residents, which is using the cafe model, community cafe model, right? Bring back that data. Begin community dialogues. Have folks actually engage with that data. And what we was able to do with these processes is then say, and by the way, this is data about you and adults in the community, their community perceptions, right? What's going on. So how would you actually like to know how well your kids are doing? And most folks, whether they have kids or not, like to know how well kids are doing in their neighborhood. Kids are the canary in the coal mine. When kids are doing better, everybody's doing better. It's not it's a parenting issue. This is a societal issue, right? So we have folks map their neighborhood, and the beauty of that EDI data, which is a population measure, which I talked about around child well-being, is that gets geocoded and mapped to the neighborhoods that people actually decide for themselves. And then what we can do is then ask folks to say, what else might you want to know? Because once you geocode and map, you can actually then overlay some of those other data systems. So what else is going on in that neighborhood that you would care about? So the tools and techniques is putting back in front of folks things that they can reflect on to say, how do I then move on this? So this is just an example of an overlay. So in the shading is the percent of kindergarten children that are vulnerable in language in these neighborhoods. And the red is the percent of children 0 to 5 who are actually read to 2 or fewer days per week. So it's trying to support people around, well, we don't want to get to this single bullet, one answer. We want people to understand there's some complexity here, right? But we want to actually see, but there might be some patterns that we really need to pay attention to that actually might be mitigating effects and really improving kids' lives. And we talk about reading, right, with parents. What we're talking and getting underneath is, what are the routines, right? Reading daily is about routines, and there's a lot of things that can disrupt your routine, right? And so that's a deeper whole conversation. So in sum, the features of an effective kind of shared measurement system for moving to that collective action, moving to population impact, for us, what it's come down to is really understanding a family of measures that represent the key influences on child's development and learning, measures that help partners reflect on their contributions and actions, measures that are feasible to collect and consider the scalability, the sustainability, and the replicability, providing information about that system in real time, right? And include expectations for change. Those numeric goal targets are key. And finally, and most critically, include measures reported by residents and parents who are the voice of the system, right? Oops, sorry. And ultimately, and this is the key that we spend most of our time on, is how do we take all of this and embed it into a learning system? We're all learning, we're learning what measures work, what are the tools putting in front of people that motivate them to act, right? What do people need in front of them in order to be able to act? Whether they're a parent, a resident, whether they're a frontline worker, whether that's a manager in a large public agency, or whether that's a policymaker. I mean, so the shared measurement system isn't there's one measure, there's one way. It's actually trying to be a tool by which everyone can actually achieve these very high-level results. So I have a few minutes for questions.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Babcock with the California Academy of Sciences. Thank you for your great presentation. My question is, it seems like the success of this hinges on that family of measures. And because it seems like, the way you described it anyway, it seems like all of the measurement and the feedback and the involvement relies on everyone having some common shared understanding of the importance of those measures as predictive measures of what you're trying to get to overall.
Right.
Yet you also mentioned in your last slide how important it is to hear from the communities about the measures that they think are important. So I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little story about how you came to an agreement on these very psychological demographic measures plus the parental measures, which might be very different.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And actually, I was trying to figure out how do I even say this, right? So, most folks, when they say, oh, let's do a parent measure, it's, oh, let's have a parent tell us what the experience is like for them in our service or in our program or whatever. Then let's have a focus group so they could actually tell us even more about what that is about. And then it's going to change and be different, right? So what we say is, you know what? You don't really need that parent focus group to tell you your parents don't like waiting 3 hours for their visit, right? You probably already know that, but you can get that information by parents being that quick feedback loop, right? Because that's about the system, right? So then if you really are going to bring parents together, then talk about something meaningful about parents and what's driving them and their interest, and how can you support them in achieving their goals. So let's change that relationship. So what is the types of data that parents are interested in, right? And so that was the critical way of why we went to, why a community survey as well. That community survey is about community perceptions, right? Community safety, what are those neighborhood conditions, right? The things that really matter in the day-to-day life of parents, their own resiliency, their social connections. And then they love to have dialogue about that. That's actually what they care. But so just saying, so it's an important distinction about what is the measures that are important to who and who has the realm of influence and really can drive change. And then what then is the role of the organizations and systems that could actually support that endeavor. Does that, I don't know if I fully.
Did you find that the parent surveys actually changed your presuppositions about those 5 research-based measures of success? Like, did you end up changing your measures as a result of that parent involvement, or?
We didn't change because those measures are child outcomes. So it's this dance that you have, right? What we actually changed is what did folks think the driver would be to support parents to actually have the results that they wanted to have for their kids. The measures of results for those kids are actually, that's rooted in the research around what we know. So it's a blending of what's happening in the local context that people can actually drive and have change. But then what are those longer term outcomes that kind of the larger society is beginning to coalesce around and agree upon as the real markers for those change. Because most parents are gonna tell you, I want my child to be successful. I want my child to be healthy. I want them to graduate. I want them to have a career. Like those weren't worrisome to parents at all. That was not worrisome, right? And they loved the maps because they could actually say, you know, I used to live in this neighborhood and now I moved over 3 blocks over and I can tell you the difference. And I can tell you the difference that it's having on my kids, right? They have a different context for understanding that need, the confluence of all the things happening in their local environment.
Just one more question.
Hi, I'm Robin Dean with the Public Health Institute, and thank you for your presentation. So presumably Magnolia Community Initiative has multiple partners, institutional partners, residents, and so forth. And so my question is more about how this is resourced. So on the one hand, if you bring multiple partners together, you might think, well, they all have a common goal, so they'll participate because they're driven by a common goal. But in reality, I believe that you always need resources. So are these organizations volunteering to participate in this shared measurement, or are they incentivized in some way? And then I guess the elephant in the room question is, how much does this really cost to do?
Yeah. No, the Magnolia is a voluntary network. People are voluntarily participating. The invitation is to align your resources, and that's your human capital, your financial capital, whatever that is for you. How do we align what we have in our expertise that we have to achieve this goal? Because some folks within the network, like UCLA, actually gets funding to do measurement, right? So if we align that goal, and how do we kind of create that synergy among the network partners? This is a prototyping site, and part of the learning throughout other people, and I think this is the challenge of all of us in this endeavor, is we're still in the learning mode. What does it cost exactly is a little unknown, but that's why we made the premise of the choices of we have to keep to the data collection has to be feasible and scalable, not just the results, right, of the intervention feasible and scalable, but the actual measurement strategy. So choosing WIC sites as a data collection site, thinking about, what measures, what's a parsimonious enough collection, but it still drives your change. For an example, I had a conversation with this community, had a federal initiative, 300 indicators they have to track with one. Another federal initiative, same community, right, has to track that another 100 indicators they have to track. They said, at least there's a crosswalk within that. And I said, well, then what is it that you're needing from us? What would you like? Well, we need data. right? So the issue is, where are we spending our time and energy, right? And what kind of data do people need? Because what they're getting is just a confluence of data at one level that's not helping them actually drive their learning and knowing if what they're doing is making a difference. Do we know full on the costs of all of that? We know the structures and we know the functions, and some of that is local nuance of who has what available to do that, but we do know it and it's much like FSG. We would like to kind of refer to the backbone organization as let's actually talk through backbone functions a little bit more in detail, because we actually have to think about what are the practices and the functions, and then how do we best support those to allow people to act differently, because this is about the synergy of effect, right? So that I can talk to you more about how we structure and what we think those functions are. Yes.
Hi, Chris Nelson at RAND. I'm wondering if there are any key partners that you think are important parts of this system here. And by the way, I love the process diagram. Are there any key partners that you just couldn't get to the table for any reason? I think that might be a common problem in a lot of systems, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to deal with that.
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing issue, and I think I think that's the local context that everybody is grappling with as well. I think what we actually, for Magnolia, what we made a decision about is we would not go forward without the public sector, right? Because the public sector, what we didn't want to have happen is, oh, here's a great private endeavor doing this really wonderful things, and the public sector going, that's really good, why don't you just keep on doing that, right? Like, we really said, how do we actually do our best thinking and best learning together? So that's why we call it a learning system. And what really, and then it's a question of people come in. It's not about, you didn't have all the right people to start. It's about who's at the table, how do we get started, how do we keep knitting and weaving and bringing other folks to the table. And that being said, we absolutely targeted key folks, key anchors in health. So we were looking at it from goal areas, who's the key anchors in health, in economics, in education, right? In that family support, that nurturing care, that social construct. So we made sure we had champions within those, and the public sector as a critical piece of it before we kind of officially said we are underway with this.